how do I use AI to solve problems? And I think as you get better educated, you learn more places to use the technology.
He said, play is often talked about as if it were a relief from serious learning. But for children, play is serious learning. Hello, and welcome back to Call Me Data. I'm David Gleason, co-founder of All In on Data, and I'm joined as usual by
Peter Memon, co-founder of All In on Data. Well, David, here we are again. And another podcast. I honestly have lost track of how many we've done. I think this is roughly 60, I would say.
Feels that way.
So I got a question for you.
Yes.
Do you have 60 Aloha shirts? I feel
Confidential information.
I feel like every time we do this is a new one on you. And I don't recall seeing that one before, but maybe I have, or maybe they're just blending into one.
I think this actually might be a repeat, but
I don't like it. Should be repeating them. I think I need to keep you on your toes.
I'm going to need a bigger wardrobe budget if we're going to do this.
I don't think your wife is going to like me if I make you go out and buy more Aloha shirts.
We're going to have to talk to the CFO of the company too about a wardrobe budget.
Yes.
So I'm excited about today's topic because it's something that we've experienced personally and something that is kind of based on our personal experience. And so basically what we want to talk about is we'll start by talking about tools that don't do what they say on the package in the AI world. And then we're going to talk about this concept of controlled experimentation and how you do safely learn to use these tools. So we'll define all of that.
Yes.
But let's
kind of jump into this. I think this is going to be a really interesting set of topics.
So one of the tools, and this applies to a lot of tools, not just the one that we're going to talk about, but one of the tools that has been, I think something you and I have both been using very heavily recently has been Claude Code.
Oh, I love Claude Code.
Yeah. So why don't you describe what Claude Code is intended for, and then we'll talk about
I think, and I will tell you how I use it as it was designed for, and I know you use it in a completely different fashion and one I never would have expected. I use it for coding. Go figure. It's called Claude Code. So when it first came out and I downloaded it and I hooked up to my Git repository and immediately started coding with it. And I have to tell you, it's very impressive, and I love using it. And it for coding purposes, it's absolutely fantastic. But, and I know the little but here, because I got the call from you last week, oh my God, I didn't know Claude Code can do this phone call. And I sat there and I'm like, huh, what? No, that's impossible. Yeah. But please.
Yeah. So I'm not using Claude Code for coding, which feels like I'm breaking some sort of rule or something. Hopefully that's allowed. If anyone from Anthropic is watching, I hope you don't mind. No, and in fact, as we'll talk about, I think I'm far from the only person doing this.
I'm sure you're not.
We have some evidence to that fact, right? But it started with, I was reading an article about the architecture of Claude Code, and the article was well written, and it started to describe like how it really works. And I realized it's an intermediary between the user and the actual Claude model. But when I looked at what it does, nothing that was described in that article about what that intermediary Claude Code function did was actually coding specific. All of the coding knowledge is still coming from the Claude model.
The model itself.
And I was like, well, that's interesting. And it sort of hurt my brain a little bit because I was like, that doesn't make sense initially.
Yeah, it doesn't click.
Right. But then I just started thinking about, wonder what I could do with this. And I started experimenting with lots of things that I guess I'll describe it this way. I'm using Claude Code to do things that you could do generally through the chat interface.
Right.
Except that a couple of things. One, it's easier to go step by step and have artifacts preserved because you're doing it through Claude Code, and I'll have to explain what that all means. But like the big difference for me is you can refine data and create files and data sets and take multiple passes at cleaning up the data, and you can use it for things that have nothing to do with writing code. You could use it for updating your resume or comparing a job listing to your resume. So one of the experiments I did early on was I fed it my resume and I set up a whole set of Claude instructions and I asked it to look at a bunch of job listings and say, how would a person with my background match against these various listings and what order would you apply to them in? Which ones should you apply? Which ones should you pass, et cetera, et cetera.
Interesting.
And you could have done that one job at a time in the chat interface, but I set this up as a sort of repeatable thing where it generated output in a directory and it generated an analysis for every job I fed it.
Wow, interesting. Now, I got to tell you, that is not a way I ever would have envisioned using Claude Code ever in a million years.
And it wasn't perfect because I have to admit my terminal skills, my bash skills were a little bit rusty. Yeah. So there were a couple of times I was really struggling to remember basic commands in the shell terminal. They all came back to me a little bit, but it's a little bit awkward because you have to do this in an IDE or with a terminal, right? And you're creating markdown files, which you need an IDE to do easily.
It's a little not user friendly.
Yeah, and it's all very text based, and I felt like I was in a science fiction movie because it looked cool. I had the black screen with lots of different colored text on it and stuff. I felt like I was you.
You mean like me? My terminal, it has a dozen terminal windows up and running.
Well, here's the funny part is, it's the first time in recent years that I actually had wished I had a much bigger monitor than I have.
Oh, like me, you mean?
Exactly.
Yes.
I started to appreciate why you use such a massive monitor. Because
So for the others who don't know, I have a massive monitor. Two, I live in terminal quite a bit. I like it. I always have. I learned in terminal, and I'm far more efficient in terminal. So yeah, I'm the guy with the Mac that uses terminal.
And he apparently has very good eyesight because you use like the tiniest font on this massive screen that I've ever seen.
7-point font on a 5K monitor.
Meanwhile, I feel like my monitor is the Reader's Digest large type version of your monitor.
And look, if I can even get a sharper monitor, I'd probably make it smaller. I know. You're looking at my monitor is not for the blind.
We're going to have to get you switched to an e-ink monitor. Pretty impressive.
I would love an e-ink monitor. If it was fast enough, I would do it in a nanosecond.
Yeah.
So much better.
Yeah. So anyway, yes, I was struggling a little bit with the early on with the adoption of having to go back into a terminal and stuff, but we'll talk about that too, because Claude has recognized this and has come out with something.
They have.
But let me give you maybe my one real example that I did the other day on.
I love this example.
It was actually pretty interesting. So I realized I hadn't been keeping track of my Apple App Store subscriptions, and I think everyone who has an iPhone knows the pain, right? It's incredibly easy and frictionless to sign up for an app, and you just lose track of how many things you're paying a subscription for.
Right.
And in my case, lose track of how much you're spending on those subscriptions.
Oh, it's easy to get away with. I mean, easy to happen.
Spoiler alert, I was stunned when I saw the actual amount.
You're generally appalled, I'm sure, when you see this. Yeah.
So my ask was really simple. Hey, I just want to go back and look at what I'm paying and how I'm spending this money over the course of 2025. The challenge is I couldn't look at my credit card receipts because they bundle multiple subscriptions together that renew within a few days of each other.
Yep.
So one credit card receipt could be for 3, 4, or 5 different app subscriptions.
Right.
And it didn't give me enough detail to know what was going on. There's no easy way to see those transactions in a detailed format except on the Apple App Store.
Right, itself, yes.
And I could do that, but there's no export function.
No.
So I was like, what am I going to do? So here's what I ended up doing. I took screenshots and I used scrolling screenshots, and I took screenshots 1/4 at a time.
Right.
And I captured 700 or 800 transactions that all took place over the course of 2025.
Wow.
Right. So 700 or 800 transactions, a little bit of a pain, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I then created a Claude Code project, and I said, take these screenshots, analyze them, extract individual transactions, and put them into a JSON file, basically set up a database in a different directory that listed all the transactions. And I said, and assign them a category that makes sense based on what the application is.
Right.
And also assign them, tell me whether they're annual or monthly or one-time purchases.
Right.
Some of that information was in that screenshot, some wasn't. The categories weren't in the screenshot, but I knew Claude would look at the application, do a little bit of research, figure out what it did, and assign a category.
Right.
So pass one was it basically went through all these screenshots and built me a little database of those 700 transactions.
Yeah.
But then I said, and here's what you couldn't do very easily without Claude Code if you were just doing this in a chat, because I needed to have this data persisted because I knew there were some problems.
Right.
Some of the problems were some of the transactions, the icon showed up, but the app name wasn't there. It just said something like monthly subscription.
Right.
But it didn't say the name of the app.
Of the app, of
Most
course.
of them did. Some didn't. And sometimes they got the category wrong.
Right.
And there were a few other weird things. So I looked at those and I went through them. And I'm looking at those screenshots, and I realized they have you ever use the memory feature of Claude Code?
Yeah.
So how do you use memory?
How do I, actually, I'll take that back. I'm sorry. I do not use memory in Claude. Yeah, I was thinking something else. I don't.
So memory in Claude's kind of interesting because if you start a line in the Claude terminal command with a hash sign, like a comment, it actually sticks that in the Claude markdown file that is part of what tells Claude what to do.
Right, yes,
so
right,
it's
right,
it's
right.
a memory.
Right.
You can write a reminder.
Yes.
So I just started making comments to Claude. I said, hash, the $3.49 monthly purchase is for the application Endel.
Right.
And it said, great, I'm going to go through. And it not only did it go through and update the database, it had already, without me asking it to, it generated a summary of what was in the database, spending by category, et cetera, et cetera. It went through and updated all of the outputs it had already generated.
Oh, wow.
And so I just issued it a bunch of memories and said, well, this should be this category, and this thing for this amount is actually this application.
Yeah.
And one of them I couldn't find, and I said, look at the thing that is, $7.99 on March 3rd. Figure out what that application is based on the icon and update all the similar entries. And it went and did it. So I used it to extract data from the screenshots, and I used it to clean up and curate that data.
Right.
And then I said, all right, create me a couple of analyses. I'd like an analysis by category, spending by category. I'd like spending by month, broken, subdivided by category, et cetera, and make them pretty. And it created me some nice looking markdown files that I could print out and look at that showed me all my spending. It was really fun.
It's fun, but it just, think about the amount of time that you saved doing all this. And
This all took me less than an hour end to end.
I know all the dependencies that you've had to manage, and it just took care of it all. Like you said, update one thing, and it took care of all the additional files that were dependent upon that. And that's just, traditionally, that's just hard, honestly. It's not, that's a lot of work to do. This to me is like one of those classic cases that most people don't think about. How do I use AI to solve problems? And I think as you get better educated, you learn more places to use the technology. Now, granted, the bar for this is a little bit higher because you and I are programmers. We know how to program computers. We understand terminals and stuff. So, mom isn't going to go do this.
Right.
Maybe mom will. I don't know. Maybe
so that's the problem is you have to, you've got to be comfortable with setting up a Claude markdown file that gives it instructions and thinking about, okay, I want one directory for the input data, one directory for the transactions, another directory where the analysis is going to land, and you're doing it in terminal. And it wasn't the easiest thing, but I mean, a dummy like me figured it out, took me less than an hour. And if I'd had to go through those manual transactions and type them into a spreadsheet.
Oh, 700, you would have been there for a week.
Yeah, I wouldn't have ever finished
You would have actually never done it. The upside is you would have never done it.
And by the way, what do you think the total dollar amount was?
Oh, you got to be close to $3,000, as I'm guessing.
Oh, I feel better now because it's like $2,300.
Oh, is that it?
But I was still shocked. I had no idea I was spending $2,300.
You don't realize it because it's those little small charges that just add up over time. You don't realize it.
Yeah.
When you start multiplying them by 12, it's like all of a sudden that $5 charge or $10 charge becomes a lot of money.
Right. Okay, so a couple of lessons learned from that, right? The reason we're talking about it is you just brought up one of them, which is the learning curve and the hard part. So let's talk about what...
let's start with that. Actually, this is great. It's a good segue into... so you told me about all of this, and then the other morning an email pops up in my terminal, and I'm like, oh, this is what David was doing. They take it and commercialized it. So Anthropic came out with something called Claude Cowork.
Right.
Now, it's not exactly the same, and it's not as flexible and as powerful as what you did, obviously. But it's only in, I think it's even alpha stages right now. So it's not generally available.
Preview, not generally available. Right. You have to be a subscriber to one of the higher tiers.
Right, which we both are, so we have access to it.
And you have to run it on a Macintosh. That's the only client it runs on.
Yeah, but also is available in a web browser.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, it was. I didn't realize it, but it's actually available in the web browser as well. Now, the beauty of it, and it's incredibly powerful because it allows you to organize all your files and everything and do effectively what you did.
Right.
In a much easier user interface without worrying about going to a terminal and learning Bash and typing in Bash commands and dealing with markdown files. You can point it at a directory. You can ask it questions. It has all sorts of predefined work functions or functions that you like to do that basically is just putting a prompt into the prompt window. So it allow you to do a lot of what you're doing, but it brings the bar way, way, way down to somebody who is not technically savvy.
Right.
Doesn't understand Bash, whatever Bash is. People don't know what Bash is. It makes it much more generally available. Yeah. And it's like Claude Code. It's just another interface on top of the language model itself, but it's a great way of organizing your work and getting a lot of value out of the models.
Yeah. And in fact, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it actually is using Claude Code in the background to do some of the
It might very well be. I don't know about that.
feels like it is.
It might very well be. Yeah. I mean, I guess the point is what you're seeing now, I think, with a lot of these platforms, and we're talking about Anthropic, the other model providers are doing similar things as well. It's not that Claude is, unique here. They are doing very similar things. It just so happens that you and I tend to use Claude a lot. It is, I'll say, democratizing some of this a little bit, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Yeah.
It's making us much more dependent upon the platforms, and they're making them much more user-friendly. And, you kind of understand how you can use this in a lot of different places where before it was a little bit, well, do I really use AI over here?
Right. But and I think the other thing that's really interesting that it points out, reinforces something we've talked about before, which is these tools are changing so rapidly and they're advancing so rapidly, and they do more than even the people who created them realize that they can do initially, right? People are always finding new and creative uses for various capabilities and AI tools.
Right.
And uses like this of Claude Code to do things that have nothing to do with generating code is a great example of that.
Right.
And so I think that people who are not paying attention to Claude Code because they don't need to write code, for example,
Right, exactly.
risk missing the boat.
And I think this is a good, you're making a really good point. A lot of these tools that are designed for a specific domain or a specific problem are applicable to more general purpose problems that are out there. You just don't think about it that way. I never would have, I would have not thought to use Claude Code to go solve my app problem.
Right.
Just wouldn't have occurred to me. I never would have. It's Claude Code. The name Code stuck in my head. I could not get out of that little box, and I was never going to get out of that little box. And and all of a sudden you call me up. I'm like, oh my God, this is something that can really legitimately be used every place.
Right. And as you said, it's not just Claude. There are new capabilities as part of the Gemini framework. There's some fantastic new capabilities in Gemini.
Yeah, they got some incredible capabilities.
Yep. There's some interesting new things that have come out of OpenAI in the last couple of months, and really all the model providers.
Yeah, all the foundation, and they all do. We when we use all of them. Over time, you kind of learn that some are different than others. I wouldn't say better. They just do different functions. Some do different functions better than the others do it.
Right.
And that's fine, but we tend to bounce around to all of them. I tend to bounce around to all of them at least. But what they're doing now is they're building, we'll say, an ecosystem of tools around it.
Yeah.
Which is really giving them a lot more power.
But at the same time, it makes people, and I will admit I'm one of them sometimes, it sometimes makes you uncomfortable. And what I mean by that is, I think in the past, we've been very accustomed to having, there's a tool for a specific task, and it's not very hard to pick the tool. If you're operating a Microsoft Office environment, you don't spend too much time saying, I wonder if I should do this in Excel or in PowerPoint. Right. There's a fairly easy decision tree about what types of work you're going to do in Excel versus Word versus PowerPoint versus Access versus Publisher, et cetera. Right.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Right.
Not anymore.
So you get these tools, and even the examples and the materials that launch with tools, they're very open-ended.
Yes.
And I think a lot of us who are used to much more prescriptive tools to accomplish this task, use this tool, you struggle. When Claude Skills were first released, I looked at them, I was fascinated by them, and yet for the first few weeks, I couldn't figure out what in the world I would do with it.
Right.
Because it was too flexible.
It's a mind shift, I think, in many ways for a lot of people. It's like you have to, you kind of only limited by your imagination at the end of the day.
Right.
And I think that for a lot of people is a bit of a struggle. Like you said, I have a hammer, it's a nail. I don't use that hammer for everything in the world, but this is really the hammer that you use for everything. It solves a broad class of problems. There's very little you cannot attack it with. I mean, there are things it does better than others, clearly, but it's a general purpose tool at the end of the day.
You could argue that no problem can't be solved with a big enough hammer, but yeah.
Well, I personally think a big enough hammer you can do almost anything, but hey.
Yeah. But I want to pick on the fact that you said imagination. I'm really glad that you used that word, because I think of imagination and creativity. Like, conventional wisdom is that creativity and imagination are not the domain of lots of jobs. They're confined to specific types of jobs.
Right.
If you're in advertising or marketing or in an art-related field, you are creative.
Right.
If you're not, when's the last time anyone in banking described themselves as a creative?
Oh, never. They never do. It's very rare. I mean, it's not that they might not be very creative, because they might be in their own way, but they'll never describe themselves that way.
And I can safely say, having taken many hundreds of hours of mandatory training at dozens of different financial institutions.
Yep.
Not one of them promoted the idea of using your imagination.
No, I haven't taken just as many. No, that was certainly not a word that ever popped up in finance.
Yeah. So I think that characteristic that you just articulated as being necessary to sort of figure out what to do with some of these tools, and especially to go beyond what it says on the label, is not something that we usually think of as a skill we take to work every day.
We don't, and I feel like, and maybe I'm going, you and I talk about education quite a bit, and the critical thinking skills, and I think we can add this to the critical thinking skill department in terms of importance. It is equally important as you have an imagination on how to use these tools, so you don't constrain yourself to a certain class of tools.
Right.
And I think for a lot of, it gets beat out of you as you get older. I think it's hard to keep the imagination and that kind of creativity going as you get older. Life just gets in the way for a lot of people, and you get consumed by that stuff, and you forget what it's like to use that part of your brain. And you got to have to train yourself to open it up. I think even us, when we started this journey, we looked at a class of problems and we saw. But now, I fell back on why I used to do this with this. I used to do this with this. Now I fall back and go kind of reverse. I now use, how do I solve this with one of the prompts first, one of the tools first, before I go use something else.
Right.
Because it just doesn't make any sense, and I'm consequently 100 times more efficient than I ever was.
Right. It takes a while to get into that mode where you stop filtering yourself.
Yes.
Like I found that in the beginning, I would look at a thing I had to do, and I would immediately in the back of my head start thinking of, well, I don't think that an AI tool could do this because of this and this and this and this.
Right.
And once you get to a place where you say, well, what if I just assume it can? How would I proceed?
How do you proceed?
And maybe I'll be wrong.
Right, but harm no foul in trying.
Let me experiment. Let me try it. Let me assume anything is possible.
Right.
And proceed from there and see if it works.
Exactly. Like Nick said, just do it.
Right. Now, the just do it has some qualifications. And this is, a term that you and I have used. Yeah. I don't know if we really originated it, but it's something we came to organically. Yep. Was this concept of, we call it controlled experimentation.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
And that is really important for this, because if you're going to just do it, just try it, just assume it'll work and see what happens.
Yes.
Obviously, there's a lot of settings in which saying, let me see what happens, could scare someone.
Yeah.
Right.
True.
So you want to find a way to blend that creativity and that imagination that you described with safety and preventing bad stuff from happening.
Yes.
Right. And to me, that is this idea of controlled experimentation.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
It's not the kind of experimentation that we all probably did when we were kids. You and I are lucky. We grew up in an era where we got science experiment kits, chemistry kits.
I was telling my kids one day, yes, when I had a chemistry kit when I was a kid, it legitimately came with cyanide amongst a bunch of other things. And
blows my mind what
and
we
you
had
could
in
go
those
on
kits.
and order those things, and they would ship it to your house for like $2. You could buy an ounce of cyanide. Go ahead, here, Mom. Here's the thing, and my parents would go happily. They had no idea. They just went in and did it.
Sulfuric acid.
Yeah. Oh, please.
Absolutely.
I mean,
you could make chlorine gas. You could make anything.
Please. It's amazing that I made it to adulthood.
Explosions.
And let me tell you, there are times I did set parts of the house on fire playing with things because I was, God bless my parents. I don't know how they didn't kill me as a child.
Yeah. So giving a preteen kid a chemistry kit is not controlled experimentation.
No, that is the very definition of uncontrolled experiment.
Yeah. So why don't we spend a few minutes and talk about what is this whole idea of controlled experimentation? And maybe I'll tee it up by the let's talk about why we need it. We leaned into it a little bit when we gave a couple of examples of, you don't know what these tools do until you try it. But it goes deeper than that, right?
It goes a lot deeper than that, especially in a business. It goes a lot deeper than that, where you want to really experiment, especially if you're trying to refine or automate a process. And you need some level of control over a number of variables to test what it is you want to test.
Right. And the fact is that as much as we might wish it were different, using at least the current crop of AI tools is unpredictable. Right. A traditional software engineering process, it's a very well-trodden path.
Exactly.
And you might make mistakes, you might underestimate tasks, you might miss out on complexity points, but generally, if you put diligence into it, You can plan, then execute, then test, and it all goes more or less according to plan.
It's highly deterministic at the end of the day.
Yes. So using large language models and generative AI, even especially embedded them deep into business processes, is often somewhat unpredictable when you start.
Right. That is absolutely the case. Well, they're statistical engines.
They're statistical engines. They behave in unpredictable ways sometimes because they are looking at inputs that we aren't conscious that they've had.
Right.
All sorts of reasons. And, a lot of our proof of concept projects are truly POCs because we literally need to prove to ourselves that the technology can work the way we think it can.
Right. And exactly. Right. So back to having a controlled experiment. What does that look like?
So let's focus on experimentation first. Then.
Yes. Okay.
And we'll layer on the controls.
Okay.
So I know when I say experiment, what do you think of? Like
first word, play.
Perfect.
Play.
Right. It's fun.
It is.
It's playing.
Should be.
And it's about discovery.
Yes.
And it's about testing things.
Yes. Yeah. All the above.
I think experimentation gets a bad rap sometimes because, scientists in a lab experiment. The other thing that comes to mind is like a scientist in a white lab coat experimenting.
Fair, yes.
But experiment and play and test and evaluate. This is what experimentation is to me.
Right. And this is very different than when we used to design systems in the past where I didn't tell a developer, go experiment.
Right. So here's the interesting thing about an experiment. You don't know what's going to happen.
No.
You don't know necessarily what step follows step A and step B and step C. But what you should know is what you're trying to get to.
Right. You should have it. And you have to, right, exactly. What you're trying to get to is very important.
You have an outcome in mind.
You have a thought,
what good looks like.
Right, exactly, yes.
Yeah. And in a perfect world, that might even be concrete enough to form like a hypothesis.
Yes.
If I do this, that will happen. But sometimes it's not even that clean.
No, definitely not.
But I like the fact that you said play because I think there is an element of play and wonder and discovery to experimentation.
Yes, 100%.
And in fact, I would argue that if you're closed off to those things, you're not going to be experimenting as much as you're just going to be going through some repetitive motion of making different attempts to do something.
Right.
And one of them might work. But that's not really experimentation.
No, not at all. It's not real experimentation. I mean,
it's just rote repetition until something works.
You're not really learning anything there.
Right.
Whereas I think with play, and I think as an adult, you have to kind of wrap your mind around that fact a little bit more because, like I said, it's been beaten out of a lot of people.
It's totally beaten out of us. I mean, like, imagine you walk in the office one day. Well, now our office, you could do this, but walk into the corporate office when you were at any of the financial firms you've worked at.
I'm going to go play today.
I'm going to play today.
Yeah, that would have flown real well. That would have gone so well.
Right. And, when you talk about people playing, that's if you describe an adult as playing, that's usually not a compliment.
No, it's not actually. It's very negatively. At a certain age, it's a certain negative connotation associated with that phrase.
So we need to change that.
I agree.
Yep.
Start today.
Let's do it. So one of the things, I feel like I have mentioned it on the podcast before, but there's a fantastic museum in Rochester, New York called the Strong Museum of Play.
I got to go here.
And when you go there, it seems like it's a kids museum at first. There's places for kids to play. But there's actually a serious quasi-academic, not quasi-academic side to it, which is all about the science of play and how play contributes to human development and understanding. Right. And one of the interesting things there is I think it sort of helps you think past the notion that you outgrow play.
Right, which yes, which is nice. I think that's, again, it's most adults just don't spend any time playing. It's just not in their, I don't know, it's just not in your focus, not in your thoughts. You just don't think about it.
Right. So we grabbed a couple of quotes on play, and I'm going to give you one of the ones I liked. Mr. Rogers.
I love this.
He said, play is often talked about as if it were a relief from serious learning. But for children, play is serious learning.
I couldn't agree with that more.
And I think what we would append to that is, in the right circumstances, with the right goals in mind, play can be a method for serious learning for
adults too.
fully functioning adults, assuming we consider ourselves.
How many times
of
do
that
you and
cohort.
I get off the phone and go, I'm going to go play for a while. I discovered this new tool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very often.
Right. And when I have finally gotten past my discomfort with the lack of structure and direction for some of the new tools and learned to use them effectively has been when I gave myself permission to just play.
You know, you said something that really I kind of latched on right now, structure and direction. And if you look at children versus adults, what is one big difference? Unstructured time versus highly structured time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And play really requires a lot of unstructured time and thinking.
Right. Right. I mean, I don't know how you work, but for me, I find I can noodle over and ponder a problem or a something I'm trying to design, and I reach a limit where I just need to like think about something else and, you know, the phrase sleep on it or just let it gel, let it ruminate in the back of your mind, but you're consciously focusing on something else, but the back of your brain, you're still cranking over on it.
Shut down.
Right. And that's the way sometimes real breakthroughs happen.
The best things I've ever done and the hardest problems I've ever solved have been that way. You know, just letting it ruminate in my brain for a long time.
So it's funny because, you know, I said I would add to Mr. Rogers' quote that like it's not just for children. And the other quote that you grabbed when we were talking about the value of play sort of speaks to that, right?
Yeah.
Which is Teresa Kessley.
Yes. You know, our brains are built to benefit from play no matter what our age. And you and I could not agree with that more. You know, and it's in some ways it sounds odd that we're talking about play in a podcast on artificial intelligence. And I think we go back, it really requires a different mindset. You know, I think at all layers to really understand and embrace and use these incredibly powerful tools and let your mind free. I saw The Matrix the other day. Free your mind. You really kind of sort of need to free your mind to think about things very differently. And that requires open-ended play and playing with these tools and, you know, understanding what kind of problems you could potentially solve. Like letting your mind really open up is incredibly important if you want to maximize the potential of these.
And for some subjects and domains, including, I believe, the new AI tools that we as a generation are learning to work with right now, play is the most effective way to get your head around some of them.
Yes.
Because there is no possible way for anyone to write into a user's manual what they can do.
No.
Right?
No. How do you write into a user manual how to use AI? You can't. There's really no way to do that.
Right. So it goes back to our whole idea of start from the assumption that what you want to do is possible with AI. Right. Think about how you would do it and make some attempts at it under the guise of controlled experimentation.
Right.
Now, to balance things out, there was a word before experiment.
Controlled.
That's
the one. It's going to loop back to that.
Yep. That was kind of important too, right?
It's a very important part of it, actually.
Yeah. I mean, so look, these are, we've talked before about some of the unintended consequences of tools, right?
Yep.
Like I think you were talking recently about someone using one of the agentic tools that ended up wiping out the contents of their disk drive.
Yes, we discussed that in the earlier podcast. Yes, it was a whoops, and it was quite apologetic that the fact that it had wiped out somebody's entire hard drive and then proceeded to tell you how to go fix the problem that it just created.
Yeah. So the point is you can do damage to, you know, your data, to your productivity, to a project you're working on. You could potentially do serious damage to lots of things and people and organizations if you're not careful.
Right. And you need a controlled experiment to do that.
Right. Right.
So what does that mean?
So I think of it through a couple of lenses. For me, one of them is, what are you trying to prevent? Right.
Correct.
And I think the easy one that everyone, when you hear controls, especially if you've ever worked in financial services where controls are a second language, right? It's easy to think about preventing malfeasance and malicious actions.
Yes.
But the other part of this is you also want to prevent against something you might do by mistake that might have a bad outcome.
Right.
Or in the case of AI, especially unintended consequences.
Right.
Right. The person who suffered the loss of their hard drive or of the data on their hard drive, they didn't delete their own data maliciously. No. They didn't make a mistake. They didn't say something wrong.
No, they didn't.
Right? There was not human error involved. There was
No.
unintended
It
consequences.
was unintended consequences there. Whatever the model misinterpreted something and it did its own thing.
Right. So the first frame for me is that if you want to have controlled experimentation, you need to control for a variety of undesirable things, ranging from human error to malicious behavior to simply unanticipated, unintended consequences.
Right.
And you need to have a number of ways to implement those controls. I think as much as possible, they should be technical controls.
Yes, I agree.
Prevent things from happening. But then there's also education, there's policies, there's things you layer on top because you can't automate every risk away.
No, you'll never automate every risk away. But you need to take a decent set of precautions, especially if you're doing this in a commercial environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're home, you play with your recipe book, who cares? Knock yourself out. But when you're in a commercial environment, you take a level of controls.
Yeah. Although even at home, if your computer's connected to the internet, there's always the possibility
That's a good point. You're right.
You
never know.
Cause problems for other people too.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe give some examples of types of controls that are out there.
Well, it's data controls. You want
Yeah.
consistency in the data that you're using. Especially if you're running an experiment, you want to be able to make sure that you can recreate the output time and time again.
That's a good point.
What is the definition of experiment? If I have, data in X and output Y, and that's what I want, and then next time I run the experiment again and it gives me Z, or something else with the exact same inputs, well, that's a failed experiment. Well, it's failed in one sense. So I think it's very important to make sure that the data you're using as part of your experiment is controlled.
Yeah, and I guess that means you know what it is, you know that it's the right data to use for the experiment, and you hit on a really good point, which is you want to be able to repeat that experiment with the same input data.
Right, over and over again and get a result that theoretically, though in a language model it might not be the case, that it is accurate.
Consistent
and accurate, yes.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good one. And I think the other part of data controls for me is you want to make sure that data is, I'll say, harmless, right? That you haven't included any real personal data, financial data, other things that you wouldn't want to have exposed in the data that you're using.
So some level of responsible AI?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of this does fall under responsible AI type things. Synthetic data may be the answer for a lot of use cases.
Absolutely, it might very well be, yes. That's a good one. It's one that we don't really speak about very often, but I think it's an option in a lot of cases.
Right.
To create fake data that is not real in the real world. So if you're trying to play with information that is PII, it might benefit you from creating synthetic data where everything is, in fact, false.
Right. I think the other one, again, none of these work for every experiment you want to run.
No.
But maybe like a sandbox environment, which
that's a great way of doing it. That's
is
controlled.
Probably a term we throw around without defining. So let's maybe define a sandbox.
A sandbox is an isolated environment, and it's controlled. Theoretically, there's no connecting to anything, and you're working in that environment alone, and there's no inputs and outputs into that environment. So if you do something, I don't know, say crazy or stupid or whatever, you can't affect anything other than what's in that sandbox environment, that controlled, tightly controlled environment.
Yeah. And I think there's these days there's probably varying degrees of sandboxes. You can have a fully segregated sandbox that literally isn't connected to any network.
Right, yes.
Or you can have a sandbox that has public internet connection, but is segregated from your corporate
network,
corporate cloud and on-prem network.
Yes.
Right. So that you're not really going to blow up anything inside your company.
Right. No, I think this is all great. And I think the key thing here is when you're doing your testing and your experimentation, understand the degree of risk you're willing to tolerate and how risky is this process. And, if it's a non-risky process, you don't need to have a full-blown, completely isolated sandbox, whereas, something else you might.
Right. And there are literally dozens of other examples of controls you can put in place to have this controlled experiment.
Right.
In fact, it's probably a whole podcast episode we could do.
Oh, I'm sure there is. And I think this becomes even more important when you move into other areas and other domains like manufacturing or pharmaceuticals or any of these areas where having controlled experiments is incredibly critical.
Right. I mean, it's funny because I know I trot this phrase out a lot, but in some ways it also comes back to good scientific method.
No, 100%. It absolutely does. No, you're right, though. It absolutely does. But that's also another thing most organizations are not very comfortable with. Well, experimentation and play are not words that large enterprises like banks are accustomed to.
Right. And I think that nor is scientific method present.
No.
And the real toxic combination in some people's minds is this combination of play and scientific method, or play and controls, or play and rigor.
Yes.
Right? They're not as opposite as they sound.
No, they're not. They're not. But a lot of this language is, I would say, new to a lot of organizations.
Right.
And if you're undergoing a transformation process, you almost need to get used to this type of a language because this is what it is.
Right. You know, it's funny because I think you and I both have many times said to our respective organizations something that amounts to the fact that a good guardrail actually lets you go faster.
Yes.
It's an enabler, not a restriction.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
And I think of it like if I'm taking a sports car out on a racetrack and I want to, hone my driving skills, right? If I'm on a racetrack with tight curves and steep banking and no guardrails and no runoff area and et cetera, or God forbid I'm on a public road, right? So I've got a lack of controls. Yeah. Obviously, I'm less safe.
Much less safe, and you're
than
more
if
cautious.
I'm on a racetrack with guardrails and crash zones and runoff areas, et cetera, and controlled access.
Right.
But here's the other part. I can go faster in the controlled
Guardrails.
environment. Not just legally go faster, but because I know that there's a safety cushion, I'm going to be able to push a little harder each time. I'm going to be able to experiment with finding the apex in a corner, with establishing where the braking zone for that turn should be, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
It's the safety that allows me to play harder.
Right, exactly, because you're not going to jeopardize, in this case, your life by positioning, because there's something there to protect you from going crazy.
Right.
So
kids are going to play harder on a jungle gym that has cushioning under it than a jungle gym that's on a blacktop parking lot like the ones we used to play on.
This is true. I miss those days. But you're right, though. I mean, and in the corporate, to correlate to a corporate environment, yes, I'm going to test things and features and functions if I know I'm not going to do any real damage to a system.
Right.
Like I know if I'm not going to modify the company's reference database, if I know I can do all sorts of things, or I can, submit trades or whatever in an environment that's fake, I'm going to push really hard if there's controls there.
Exactly. And that hard pushing translates directly into you are going to learn more and learn faster.
Yes.
And you're going to solve problems more efficiently at the end. Because, again, this is not about having fun, although it is fun sometimes.
Yeah, no.
Solving problems is great fun.
Right.
But it ultimately is about how do you meet the business objectives? How do you solve the problem? And I think the somewhat counterintuitive thing that we hope you take away from this little conversation is controlled experimentation, safe playing, is often the most effective way to solve certain types of problems.
I couldn't agree more.
And I wish more people found themselves in a situation in which they could engage in that kind of controlled experimentation.
No, I agree. It's unfortunate, I think, most don't. And we're fortunate enough to be able to do a lot of this work.
Right. I just thought of one form of controlled experimentation that does seem to sometimes get some corporate backing, and that's the internal hackathon. Which has some
elements of you get some data and you can go do some stuff and they control it pretty tightly, and you could, you definitely see that. But I think for most organizations that's the exception, not the norm.
Yes.
Like I want to be in an organization where, especially in the age of AI, where there is so many processes going to overturn, I think, change dramatically most organizations and their processes. Experimentation almost needs to be a daily event.
Yeah.
You need to be part of your thinking and how you're moving forward and how you're changing the organization. And I know that sounds crazy, and there are those that will look at me and go, you can't do that in an organization. You can't have that constant rate of change. It's too disruptive. And yes, I get all that. But you also cannot have it either. You cannot not have people playing and testing and pushing all the time, because if you're not, somebody else is.
So let me make the implied explicit, because I think this is really important. If you are a business leader and you are looking at rolling out AI deeply into your organization, you cannot count on this being a traditional plan, execute, monitor sort of approach. You must create an environment in which people are given the knowledge and the tools and the guardrails to engage in some form of controlled experimentation. That doesn't mean surrender all control and let them do anything they want. It means that you can still decide which experiments to greenlight. You can monitor those experiments. You should monitor those experiments. You should be prepared to end them if they don't show signs of promise, and fund other experiments and continuously innovate. And frankly, this is what innovation looks like.
Right.
So if you're creating an AI rollout plan or a strategy, you should be paying very close attention to this conversation and the concept of controlled experimentation.
100%, absolutely. I think and organizations can't embrace enough of this.
Right.
Change is happening. It's happening fast, and you need to be able to do this. And there's also the side benefits of obviously play and learning and controls is you make your organization a lot smarter.
Yeah.
And I think that's absolutely critical. And I think that often goes unnoticed. Just to segue off into something a little different, most organizations, and you and I, again, I think beat this horse to death, but we'll keep beating it forever. This tends to fall under IT, and that's not something that they are really generally comfortable with.
No.
And you really need to, when we say play, you can't just give it to a bunch of software developers to tell them to go play. You really need to give it to a bunch of business people who understand and have deep domain knowledge about what they are doing on a regular basis and let them play.
Because remember, we said that experimentation must be directed. That means it should be conducted by the people who actually have a goal.
Right, exactly.
Right? The business person who's responsible for a specific step in a process
Yes.
knows what success looks like and knows what they might experiment with to achieve that with AI.
Mastery of a process and mastery of your organization, mastery of whatever domain you're working in is going to allow you to ask all the hard questions or the hard things.
Yeah.
So those are the people that should be doing a lot of this testing and quote unquote playing.
So this is not exactly the type of conversation we have on all of these podcasts. We often skew a little bit more technical or a little bit more business focused. This is sort of philosophical in a sense.
Yeah, philosophical, but also I think very practical.
Thank you. That is exactly where I wanted to go with this. Is it might feel philosophical. This is one of the most important things we've talked about in a long time on this podcast, because you will not be successful without some degree of controlled experimentation.
And we've seen this when we've spoken to clients or potential clients, and we see in many cases how this is not the norm. This is not how they think, but we also see it as a big shortcoming that we know they have to get there, and if they get there, they can only accelerate their journey quite a bit.
Yeah.
And it's hard. It's hard to make that mind shift. I'm not trivializing any of this. For any organization that's been running a successful business for a long time, you're set in your ways. It's hard. Change is hard. Changing your mindset about how you approach a problem or a business problem that you've been solving for decades, and all of a sudden changing it. It's not easy to wake up and go, let me think about this differently every single day. So I don't want to trivialize this, but I think what we articulate here is, like you said, it's philosophical, but it's realistic and very practical.
Well, Peter, thank you for another fascinating conversation. We covered a lot of ground today.
Well, we always do.
We always do. We started talking about some unconventional ways to use AI tools, such as Claude Code, and how it seems like in the case of Claude Code, Anthropic has seen that pattern and releasing Claude Rework. Mm-hmm. But I think the real takeaway was these tools do far more than it says on the tin.
Yes.
And they do more than the people who created them necessarily envisioned when they launched the tool.
Right.
And so if you don't experiment with them, you're never going to understand the full value.
No, you're never going to. And I'll use a quote only because I watched the movie the other night, The Matrix. Free your mind.
Free your mind.
You have to free your mind. I hate to say that, but I think that really is, in many ways, the ticket. You have to free your mind and find ways to use these tools in ways you never thought possible before, because they are incredibly powerful general purpose tools.
That's right. And then we pivoted to or extended that thought really around how do you free your mind in a safe and responsible way through what we call controlled experimentation.
Right, which allows you to experiment in a controlled environment and really, truly be free testing things you normally wouldn't test in an uncontrolled environment.
Right. And controlled experimentation then leads to a more safe, responsible development process.
Exactly.
Because you've taken some of the risk out, you've played in a safe space, and now you know what you're going to build and how you're going to build it.
And you know how to push the boundaries into the very end. You know how far you can go before you got to kind of push back a little bit and get great results.
Good. Well, you've been watching another episode of Call Me Data. Again, this is brought to you by myself and Peter from All In on Data. You can find our podcast in all the usual suspects on all the podcasting platforms, as well as on YouTube on the All In on Data channel on YouTube. And please, we would always love to see your feedback, especially if it's kind, but even if it's not, leave us a review, leave us questions and thoughts, subscribe, and we will see you next time on Call Me Data.
David, it's been an absolute pleasure as always. You have a great day.
Thank you, Peter. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.